Now, as I alluded to earlier, there were multiple civil rights organizations that were active during the 1960s. The feminist movement, the gay liberation movement, the Chicano movement, the Red Power movement, right? So there's a number of different organizations being active at this time. So first, let's start with the feminist movement. So while the feminist movement had been somewhat silenced during the years of conformity in the 1950s, the movement experienced a revival in the 60s. Okay, so before the 50s, some feminists had been calling for the freedom to have sexual relations beyond just for procreation. Okay, the birth control pill, which became widely available in the 1960s, they allowed this to become a reality. Okay, and so basically, people, women could take the birth control pill and they could, freely have sexual relations without worrying about getting pregnant. So this led to the free love movement, or otherwise known as the sex revolution, where young people had casual sexual relationships without worrying about the responsibility of having children. Feminists also called for the end of laws that prohibited abortion, arguing that women should have the right to decide on whether they're going to have a child or not. Okay, they should have control of their bodies. Feminists worked hard to get women's issues heard as part of the political debate of the time. Okay, so issues like abortion would go on to become a major political issue all the way up to the present. There were also a number of laws passed by Congress that supported women's equality, such as the Equal Pay Act, which outlawed unequal pay and sexual discrimination against women. Unfortunately, there are still examples of women receiving less pay than men who do the exact same job even today. But the Equal Pay Act was one step closer to bringing about equality for women. Now, the gay liberation movement actually began to develop in the 1950s and really started to take off in the 1960s. So in the 50s, you had the establishment of the Mattachine Society, who worked to dispel the negative stereotypes associated with gay and lesbian people. Now, one particular incident helped to really set off the gay liberation movement at the end of the 1960s, and this is the Stonewall Uprising. Okay, the Stonewall Uprising helped to radicalize the gay liberation movement. And so what happened was police officers raided a homosexual club at the Stonewall Inn in New York in 1969. And this raid set off a series of protests. Okay, and so you have gay and lesbian protesters rioting for several days afterwards. And so this helps to really radicalize the gay liberation movement and get things moving. In the 1970s, the first gay pride marches took place as gay and lesbian people took to the streets and began to more openly call for equal rights, privileges, and respect. The Chicano movement and the Red Power movement were examples of race-based civil rights movements that came together in the 1960s and 70s as Chicanos and Native Americans began to not only show pride in their cultural heritage, but also call for equal rights. In the Chicano movement, organizations like the Crusade for Justice out of Colorado spoke out against police brutality. Okay, labor unions like the United Farm Workers of America, led by Cesar Chavez, fought for the rights of Mexican and Mexican American workers. Native American organizations like the American Indian Movement fought for the recognition and honoring of treaty rights. Okay, the American Indian Movement used radical protest tactics such as takeovers, where the group would occupy a location such as the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C., or Wounded Knee in South Dakota, right? And these occupations were an attempt to force the federal government to the negotiating table to hear their demands. And much of their demands were involved the honoring of treaty rights. Okay, so the 1960s involved a number of different civil rights organizations who were fighting for their rights. Now, what about the Supreme Court and all this? Does the Supreme Court play a role in the rights revolution, right? As all these different groups are trying to fight for their civil rights? Well, let's go into it. The Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, played a pretty important role in securing civil rights for many Americans in the 1950s and 60s. Remember, we talked about how the federal government had infringed upon the rights of communists or people who were suspected of being communists in the 1950s. Remember that? Well, the Supreme Court, made a decision on a series of different cases involving communists in 1957. Okay, and basically the Supreme Court ruled that communists and anyone who dissented against the government or even the democratic political system, they had a right to discuss or put out publications promoting their ideology. Okay, so they could put out pamphlets, criticizing democracy or criticizing the government, and they could do this without being persecuted or being arrested. Okay, they couldn't be forced to reveal if they were communists. They didn't have to answer questions from Congress, as we saw during the period of McCarthyism, right? So the Supreme Court ruling is basically protecting the freedom of speech for people who want to criticize the government or criticize democracy or whatever. So those who opposed the court's decision, such as the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who had been investigating communists, they call this Red Monday. Okay, so they're calling the Supreme Court decision Red Monday, as in the day when communists got a favorable decision from the Supreme Court. Okay, so now communists and socialists, they could print out their pamphlets, they could speak in public, they could criticize the government, they could criticize democracy, and they're not going to get arrested, they're not going to get persecuted. Okay, so this brings an end, and this is in 1957. So this is bringing an end to that period of McCarthyism and anti-communism. Now, the Supreme Court also invalidated a number of Jim Crow laws that institutionalized segregation and racial discrimination in the South, such as in the case of Loving versus Virginia, where the Supreme Court struck down Jim Crow laws that outlawed interracial marriage. Okay, so now the Supreme Court is also contributing to desegregation, okay, getting rid of segregation in the South. The case of Miranda versus Arizona established that individuals need to be read their rights by police officers before being arrested. Okay, you've probably heard of the Miranda rights. Okay, like you have the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, etc. Right? That has to be read. So again, you have the Supreme Court making rulings that are protecting the rights of individuals. Okay. The court also found that the Constitution indirectly ensures the right to privacy. The case of Griswold versus Connecticut involved a law that outlawed the use of contraceptives, birth control. But the court found that married couples had the right to use contraceptives. It was their private business, and the state of Connecticut didn't have the right to infringe upon that privacy. So Griswold versus Connecticut is helping to ensure the right of privacy of citizens, right? Yes, it had to do with contraceptives, but overall, it's helping to protect privacy, the privacy of citizens. And then finally, in 1973, the Supreme Court found that women had the right to have an abortion, right? Something that feminists had been advocating for decades. And this was a major victory, but also it sparked years of intense debate between conservatives who are against abortion and liberals, okay? More recently, this case, Roe versus Wade, which had given women the right to have an abortion, more recently, Roe versus Wade was overturned, right, by the Supreme Court. So states can now pass anti-abortion laws. And so the debate over abortion between conservatives and liberals goes on today.